Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to the lineup. Today is May the 4th, 2023. I'm Barry Stagner. Very glad to have you joining with us this evening. And we've got a lot of things to cover tonight, so we'll jump right in. Wanted to mention something at the outset. We've all been, I think, hearing about the battle going on in Sudan, the power struggle between two generals, and all the other things happening there. And I just wanted to remind some of you who've been with us for a while that Sudan, as recently as February, were talking about restoring or initiating diplomatic relations with Israel, and we made mention of the fact that this area is mentioned in the Ezekiel war scenario as part of the region of the world that's going to invade Israel. Now, in most of the newer translations, you'll find the term Ethiopia mentioned right before Libya in Ezekiel 38. And we need to understand this is not modern day Ethiopia, because modern day Ethiopia is largely a Christian nation. But in the King Jimmy, it's referred to as Put and Cush. And these are sons of Ham, grandsons of Noah. Now, when you find the term Ethiopia in the New King James Version or the ESV or any others who translate it as Ethiopia, what that word means is the area south of the Nile, and that would be Sudan. So when in 2020, Sudan started making these overtures toward Israel, jumping on board with the Abraham Accords and wanting to get involved in establishing a relationship with Israel, we mentioned back then that something's got to happen to change that because they are going to invade Israel along with Turkey and Russia and Persia and Libya, according to Ezekiel 38. So something had to change. Now, I don't know exactly how this is going to play a role in that, but we do know there's an internal power struggle for who's going to rule the country, a country now under military rule. And who knows where this is going to go. But I think it's interesting that back in 2020, we made note of the fact that this is going to break down. It has to break down because they are not pro-Israel. They are going to be anti-Israel when it comes time for the Ezekiel invasion. So keep an eye on what's happening in Sudan. That is a biblically named place that is directly related to prophetic events in the last days. So we'll just keep an eye on that, see what happens there, and how this develops. So, on with our stories. I'm sure we have all heard about what happened with the drone strike on the Kremlin. Rather interesting development. And Reuters says Moscow says Putin was unscathed after Ukrainian drones targeted the Kremlin. And Russia is claiming that Ukraine carried out two nighttime drone strikes targeting the Kremlin residence of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And Russia's presidential press service reported. According to a May 3rd statement released by the press office, the twin drone attacks occurred late on May 2nd, and both drones fell on the grounds of the Kremlin in Moscow without causing casualties or material damage after being disabled by electronic warfare measures. Well, I don't think they were exactly disabled because we saw smoke rising, and many of us, you've probably seen the actual strike on the dome there of the Kremlin. And Moscow regards the incident as an act of terrorism. And we consider this a pre planned terrorist action and an attempt on the life of the Russian president. Now, we know there's an international law against assassinations and of world leaders. And, this kind of opens a rather interesting door, potentially, because the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, told reporters shortly afterwards that Putin wasn't even in the Kremlin complex when the alleged attacks occurred. And since Russia has launched its invasion of Ukraine early last year, drones have been used with increasing frequency by both sides, the article goes on to say. But one of the important things to remember is that former President Dmitry Medvedev made a very clear statement that it's time to take Zelensky out and his team. So, this opened a rather interesting door, and we'll see again how that develops and what will come of that. Is Russia going to strike back? Is this going to open the door in the international community for taking out world leaders? Or who knows where this is going to go? But an interesting development. And, Ukraine has denied the fact that they had any involvement. But, this again has so many elements related to it as it relates to Bible prophecy. These major portions of the world and the impact they have on Europe and the dependency that they have on the natural gas and petroleum products that come out of Russia. And, Russia and Ukraine, kind of known as the breadbasket of Europe, and all the food and wheat and grain and all that, to say nothing of energy related products that comes out of there, makes this, again, a rather interesting scenario as we continue to watch it develop. And, we've been talking about the fact that, Putin has made some rather interesting statements of late regarding the West and his motivation, trying to protect the way of life, the Christian way of life, especially there in Russia. I'm talking about, how the West has lost its way, and, that Ukraine needs to come back under the covering of Russia, Mother Russia, for its safety and well-being, and, just all these things we're hearing. But, so many tentacles in this, that feed into other elements of the prophetic scenario. It's just something to always keep in mind. We talking about the money that's been funneled over there. We've got a couple of stories related to another area of impact directly on the United States. And, I just wanted to mention something that I saw pop up online. Amir did a couple updates this week, and I was watching one of them. And he made mention of, I think it was in relation to his latest book, Has the Tribulation Started? And the rapture of the church. And I saw several people get on and say, the rapture's at the end of the tribulation, or the rapture can't happen until there's a global revival and all this stuff. And, hey, I'm all for a revival. But, the Bible actually teaches exactly the opposite, that things are going to get worse and worse. The love of many are going to grow cold. The loss of human natural affection is going to be dominant. 2 Timothy chapter 3 talks about the perilous times that we're going to be living in. And Jesus himself said it's going to be as it was in the days of Noah. And one of the elements of the days of Noah, as Peter says, Noah was a preacher of righteousness. And, we have to remember that tells us that for the 120 years that he was building an ark, he was preaching, and his preaching fell on deaf ears, which is exactly what's happening today. Men will not endorse sound doctrine. They prefer fables and things that tickle their ears, even within the so-called church. And, the receptivity to the gospel message is just in many areas an incredible all-time low, where in other areas, like Iran, places you wouldn't expect, the word of God is moving and rescuing souls from death. And Egypt and Lebanon, just God is moving there, and the church is growing by leaps and bounds. But places like Europe, places like America, it's headed in the other direction. Very, very interesting times that we live in, but all biblically prophesied. So, one of the things to remember when Jesus was talking in the Olivet Discourse, and, I would not agree with those who say the Olivet Discourse has no content related to the church age for multiple reasons. One, because he talked about and used the phrase in the days before the flood. That means he's talking about something that's going to happen in the days prior to a time of God's global wrath, like the flood. And the tribulation period, the 70th week of Daniel, is a time of God's global wrath. So he is talking about things that are going to be happening prior to the rapture of the church and the ensuing tribulation that follows, whether there's a time period between the rapture, or how long of a time period, I should say, between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation, we don't know. But we do know that the man of sin cannot be raised to power by Satan until the hindering force of the Holy Spirit is taken out of the way. So in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus said, when you see these things at their beginning, and this is consistent with what he said in Matthew 24, 3-8. He said, these are the beginning of sorrows. And that phrase can be translated as the commencement of birth pangs. These wars, rumors of wars, pestilence, weather anomalies, and all the other things, the famines, false Christs, all the things we see listed there in what I call the preamble to the Olivet Discourse. He says, when you see these things begin to happen, look up, for your redemption draws nigh. And that's speaking of the redemption of these bodies. And the dead in Christ rising first, and we who are alive and remain meeting the Lord in the air. And very exciting to consider that. And I think we always have to keep that in mind, when we're dealing with all this heavy stuff that is going on all around the world, around us, not knowing where all this is going to lead. We've got, all this just, I would say, intentionally frightening talk about economic collapse. And, there is going to be an economic collapse. And I don't know that we'll see the worst of things. Well, I don't think we'll see the worst of things during the church age because God takes care of his people. And that's one reason I believe California has been spared. And that's because the church is big here in California. A lot of Christians in California. And, there's a lot of ugly stuff that stems out of California and spreads through the rest of the nation and around the world. But, God is faithful, and he's given us all the information that we need. He's given us all things pertaining to life and godliness so that these days won't come upon us, and the rapture and the tribulation won't come upon us suddenly or like a thief in the night. We're always to be expecting the instantaneous translation into the supernatural realm, as Paul described in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 50 to 52. And this is something that I believe could happen, and many throughout the church age have believed that it could happen at any moment. So that's why Jesus said, therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at a time of low expectation. And it can't get any lower, I believe, than it is right now. So, who knows what this is going to lead to? Is are Putin and Medvedev going to respond and try and take out Zelensky? And what kind of can of worms is that going to open as far as in the international community at high levels of power? Is there going to be a rash of assassination attempts, or, who knows what this is going to lead to? But we do know that there are wars and rumors of wars that are abounding in times such as these. Now, we also know that the centerpiece of what's going to be happening in the last days is the nation of Israel. And the Times of Israel is reporting that the IDF reported that Gaza terror groups fired 104 projectiles at Israel in a day-long flare-up. And the Israeli Defense Forces on Wednesday morning said Palestinian terrorists had launched 104 projectiles from the Gaza Strip amid a day-long flare-up in violence sparked by the death of a prominent Palestinian Islamic Jihad member while on a hunger strike in an Israeli prison. And speaking to reporters, IDF spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said the projectiles included rockets, mortars, shoulder-launched missiles fired at Israeli aircraft over Gaza. The Iron Dome air defense system intercepted 24 of the projectiles, marking a 90% interception rate of rockets headed for populated areas, Hagari said. And another 48 projectiles landed in open areas in southern Israel. 14 fell short in Gaza. 11 landed in the sea, and another 7 had unknown impact sites. And Hagari said the IDF was investigating the circumstances that led to at least 2 rockets landing in populated areas, including one that hit a construction site in the southern city of Sderot and wounded 3 foreign nationals, 1 moderately and 2 lightly. And police have said officers dealt with at least 5 rocket impact sites in urban areas, some of which landed close to homes, which the IDF did not include in its tally. Israel obviously responded and struck 16 separate targets belonging to the Islamic Jihad and Hamas terror groups across the Gaza Strip overnight. Hagari went on to say, including a training camp, another base that housed a weapons production site, a concrete production plant, and a training site, a site belonging to the Hamas naval commandos, and a tunnel used by Hamas in southern Gaza. And again, it's interesting to watch the international community and so many, pointing the finger at Israel. It's as though the 104 rockets were warranted. And because a man chose to stop eating in protest of his imprisonment, and he starved himself to death. It wasn't like, the Jews or the IDF or the prison guards wouldn't feed him. He wouldn't eat. He starved to death, went on a hunger strike, and died. And but of course, this is Israel's fault because he, as a terrorist, was wrongly being imprisoned, at least in their mind. And again, it's really disheartening and discouraging to see so many within the church who don't spend enough time to study the history of the nation of Israel, as well as what God has said he's going to do in the last days, over and over and over. He said he's going to bring them back into the land. He took responsibility for the diaspora. He said, I'm going to scatter you amongst the nations. But in the last days, I'm going to remember the promises I made to the forefathers, your ancestors, and I'm going to bring you back into the land. And he has done just that. And he also promised that when they come back into the land, they will never be uprooted. And they will maintain their identity as God's chosen people. And, just so many pro-Palestinian movements going on in the church. And listen, there's Christian Palestinians, just like there's Christians in pretty much every nation around the world. And it's not that anybody hates the Palestinians, but you know what? That land is the land God gave his chosen people, the Jews. It doesn't belong to anybody else. No one has a right to it. And it doesn't matter, if there were some Palestinians living in the area. The fact remains that they moved out of and abandoned their homes on May 14th, 1948. Those who are called Palestinians today, which, by the way, was a coined term in 1967, at least as it applies to the Arab peoples. Most of the people known as Palestinians today are Syrian Arabs. And any Muslim scholar who's actually knows what he's talking about will tell you that, and many of them have. And that's why the Palestinians have had, kind of up and down support from much of the Arab community because of a lot of the things that they're laying claim to, which simply aren't true. Besides some of their practices as well. And, not, of course, the Persians, at least the administration there in Iran is in full support of them, and the leading exporter of and supporter of terror, the Iranians there in the Middle East. But, watching all these things happen and remembering that, God has said this is exactly what's going to go down in the last days. Zechariah 12:3 talks about the fact that Jerusalem is going to be a burdensome stone to all peoples, and all peoples means all peoples. And that will include whatever, form. And one of the things I think that's also important to remember is according to Revelation 17 and 18, where we have a detailed record of what's going to happen with Babylon. And we also have information regarding the Antichrist and his team that he puts together to divide the governance of the world between these who are alongside of him. But it says in Revelation 17 that these have received no kingdom as of yet. And the geopolitical landscape after the rapture is going to completely change. So we don't know if their country names are going to change, or, how the world is going to be divided up. Is there just going to be one country called North America? Or, what's going to happen with China? Is there going to be a country named China? We don't know. But what we do know is that there'll be one person in control of the whole planet, and that is the one known as the first beast of Revelation chapter 13. So whatever form or shape the United States takes after the rapture of the church, whatever its name may be, it is going to join the rest of the world and be against the nation of Israel. All nations are going to be anti-Semitic and seek the destruction of the nation of Israel. And we know that because of what continues in Zechariah 12-14, because the Lord is going to fight against those nations that gather against Jerusalem. So again, just watching all of these things and the world, continuing. We talked about last week that the UN is going to actually commemorate Nakba Day, the day, where it's a national day of mourning amongst many of the within the Arab community. It's the day that Israel became a nation. The catastrophe is what the word actually means. And the United Nations is going to side with the Palestinians and the rest of the anti-Semitic community in the world, and commemorate this day, the tragedy, the catastrophe of the day when Israel became a nation once again. So we're watching so many things develop that tell us, this 75th birthday of Israel coming up. And of course, they've already commemorated it because their calendar is a lunar calendar, and they, it falls differently every year. I think it falls early in May. Next year, they celebrated on April 25th, I believe it was, this past year, the rebirth of the nation. But on the Gregorian calendar, which is what we follow, May 14th, 1948, Here in the States, May 15th, 1948, if you're following the Gregorian calendar in the Middle East, was when Israel was born as a nation again. That's 75 years ago. And I do believe that what the Bible says, what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse, that this generation will not pass away until all these things recorded in the Olivet Discourse take place. And I believe with strong evidence that the fig tree budding is representative of the rebirth of the nation of Israel. Hosea talks about it, Joel talks about it, Jeremiah talks about it. Hosea and Joel use the fig tree as an idiom for Israel. Jeremiah even calls Israel a fruitless fig tree. And that's the whole purpose of the cursing of the fig tree when Jesus came in during the Passion Week and looked to a tree that had no fruit because it wasn't in season for fruit. Well, Jesus knew that, so there had to be a symbolic meaning to it. And the symbolic meaning was that Israel was not going to accept their Messiah. The tree the next day was dried up from the roots, speaking of the diaspora, the scattering of the Jews outside of the national homeland, and putting forth leaves and budding again, being ready for new fruit, what the fig tree would do that's in its normal processes, speaks of the rebirth of the nation of Israel. And when you see that happen, this generation will not pass away. And how long a generation is, we don't know, but I believe that it is significant and we need to be paying attention, especially in light of all the other peripheral things going on regarding the nation of Israel and the nations that are someday going to invade Israel, and as well as the fact that Syria is in the news every single day, and all of the military hardware that's within that country, and how often Israel is making strikes in Syria, and that Isaiah 17:1 prophecy hanging out there, that Damascus will become a ruinous heap. All this is going to happen because the Bible said it would. And that's why I started off with the Sudan thing. We don't need to get, too concerned because, Sudan says, well, we're actually wanting to normalize ties with Israel. Well, that may be the tune they're singing right now, but that's going to change because they're going to invade Israel and come to take plunder and booty, as Ezekiel 38 and 39 records. Now, the Jewish News Syndicate says as Russia's shadow grows, Europe is increasingly turning to Israeli defense tech. And again, we do know that because of the statement that I just made about the Ezekiel war scenario, when the protesting nations, Sheba and Dedan, which is the Arab Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, asked these invading nations, what's the purpose of this invasion? Is it economic in nature? We know that that's definitely going to play a role. But, there are obviously going to be other issues that feed into the decision. And I believe that this has potential to do just that. Finland, Germany, and the Netherlands are all in line to purchase advanced Israeli defense systems. As the Russia-Ukraine war enters its second year, European states are scrambling to modernize their armed forces and air defenses. And the result has been a spike in European defense spending, totaling some $345 billion for Central and Western European countries in 2022, 30% higher than in 2013, according to data compiled by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. That in turn has translated into growing acquisitions of Israeli defense technology. Now, remember, when this whole Ukraine thing first happened and Israel made some statements that were negative about the Russian invasion, Russia told them, you better watch your step in Syria. And Russia had been turning a blind eye. And, we have to remember the Russians have no love for the Iranians or the Persians. And they're just all, in the same basket as far as the economic needs that are associated with the Ezekiel war. But, some of the things that the Iranians were doing, Russia was letting without any type of interference or diplomatic efforts to slow it down or stop it, was letting Israel run their sorties into Syria and take out the supplies that were being brought in via aircraft or truck or however they were trying to sneak in military hardware. The Iranians were trying to sneak in military hardware into Damascus to get it closer to the border of Israel. And Russia was basically allowing that to happen, or not interfering at the least. And they made some very strong statements regarding these types of things in the future, and basically saying, okay, you want to talk trash on us? Well, then you better watch your step when you think the next time about going into Syria, where we have troops and air defense systems. And that's why I said, could this be a catalyst to that? And again, the primary reason for the invasion of Israel by the five nations named in the Ezekiel war scenario, even though there's a multitude of names there, they're related primarily to Turkey and the southern steppes of Russia, as well as Libya and Sudan and Iran. And the whole point of this is that there's going to be something that is just the final proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Could it be Israel supplying military hardware or defense systems to nations like the ones we just named a moment ago? And in Ukraine itself, the government is reportedly planning to soon test an Israeli-made early warning system for civilians, alerting them to incoming aerial threats, according to Axios. And this was reported just a couple of weeks ago. The Israeli system is to connect Ukrainian military radars and air defense networks to the alert system, enabling more precise warnings in targeted areas, according to the report. Now, I know many of us have the Red Alert app, and we see when rockets are fired from the Gaza into Israel. And, some of these areas, they have like 15 seconds to find cover because of their proximity to the Gaza Strip before the missile or the rocket is going to strike wherever it's going to land. And, this is a system they're talking about, an alert system for the citizenry of Ukraine, so people can find cover before these strikes hit them. And the Israeli government confirmed that the defense ministries of Israel and Germany, together with Israel Aerospace Industries, have launched discussions to accelerate the drafting of an agreement for the procurement of Israel's Arrow 3 air defense system. And the cost of the deal is estimated at around 3 billion euro, 3.3 to be exact. The IAI-made Arrow 3 is operational in Israel as part of the country's multi-tier air defense program. Now, again, now you have Israel selling technology and weaponry that is basically capable of intercepting ballistic missiles even above the Earth's atmosphere. And the Arrow 4, which is under development right now, will operate both within and outside the atmosphere. And Berlin is acquiring the system to protect itself against Russian missile threats. So, it's easy, just a short leap, to see how Russia could say, well, you've sided against us. And maybe that would be, okay, there's no more reason to hesitate. We know we don't want competition for the natural gas market in Europe, which Israel has already invaded via Egypt, as Egypt liquefies the gas, ships it off to the market, the European market. And Israel's cost for natural gas per cubic foot is far cheaper than Russian natural gas. So it's going to be the preferred source as well. So who knows? Just something is going to be, as I said, that proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. And we'll just see where all this leads. Israel's now exporting missile defense systems and alert systems to places that Russia would rather that they didn't. Israel 365 has an interesting story, and the headline says depleting military supplies in Israel will lead to the U.S. losing the war against evil. And this, according to a military expert. Strategic U.S. munition stores in Israel are being depleted in order to arm Ukraine in its war against Russia, Israeli media reported, and without a timeline of replenishment. One expert claims the move threatens U.S. and Israeli security in a fight of good against evil. The shipments have been ongoing since 2022, when a shipment of about 300,000 artillery shells was approved by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid when they served as prime ministers of Israel. Ukrainian forces are reportedly firing 90,000 artillery shells per month, far outpacing the manufacturing capabilities of the U.S. and Europe combined. The approval was seen as a way for Israel to maintain good relations with the U.S. as it supported Ukraine without antagonizing Russia against Israel. Russia has a substantial military presence in Syria, including advanced anti-air systems, which is what we just mentioned a moment ago. Israel has provided large amounts of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but has a policy of only providing Ukraine with non-lethal aid. So the shipments from Israel are intended to replenish dwindling U.S. supplies to Ukraine. Israel Hayom, another news outlet, reported that some of the munitions have been shipped out of the Ashdod port on Saturday in order to avoid drawing attention to the move. Now, there's been a lot of talk here in the States, if you live outside the United States, about the $118 billion that the U.S. has sent to Ukraine. When we've got our own needs here at home and the number of homeless veterans and other things that come up. And, there's people on both sides of the issue making very emotional pleas. But the truth is, $118 billion is a lot of money, especially when you consider that the CDC's annual budget is only $12 billion. And the EPA's annual budget is only $11 billion. And here we are sending $118 billion of, get this, borrowed money to Ukraine. And of course, we don't want to see Ukraine fall. And of course, we want to stand on the side of what is right and all those other things. But, it's just interesting that we're depleting our own munition sources there in the Middle East. And, here at home, we've had just massive changes in military production and budgeting here in the United States. So, again, why isn't the United States in Bible prophecy? Well, it could be because after the rapture there isn't one, and could be that the restructuring of the geopolitical platform of the world is, as such that there's no more countries as we know them today, like we talked about a moment ago. But are we putting ourselves in a way where we're basically defenseless, where we couldn't? And that's what the point of the article was. There's been so many munitions that were stored in Israel for the purpose of their own defense and to give an offensive position to the U.S. in the Middle East. The stockpiles are being so depleted that, as this one expert warned, there's not enough to defend us anymore. So again, just so many developments here of late that remind us that we need to keep looking up. Seems like our redemption is nigh. That's to say nothing of just the radical moral failures going on, and the loss of natural affection and the hatred of God and all the other things we see going on in this country and around the world. But I think a lot of people, when we talk about the U.S. and what we're experiencing here, so many of these things are completely foreign to us that other countries have experienced in their long history, persecution and, the diminishing of the value of the Christian faith. And, we've never been a Christian country in the sense that everybody here was a Christian and practiced the same religion. The founding fathers even dealt with some of those things in some of their writings about, we are primarily a Christian nation. We are to prefer. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the First Supreme Court, said that we are to prefer Christians as our leaders here in the United States. So, but it's true that not everybody has been a Christian. We are not a chosen people like the nation of Israel. But Psalm 33. Verse 12 says, "Blessed is the nation, the Goy, the non-Jewish nation, whose God is the Lord." And we have said, and it's on every coin exchange and dollar bill printed, "In God we trust," and that has changed dramatically here in the recent years. And one of the things that always comes to my mind is the Lord Jesus himself, when he was on the earth. He proclaimed a woe to those who cause children to stumble. And, there's a spiritual meaning to that. But, we also know that God had never had in his mind the sacrifice of children. The sacrifices to Moloch and all those other things that we read about in the Old Testament. He said, that never came to my mind, to offer your children to the fire. And, the Lord obviously when he said, that children are a heritage from the Lord. Happy is the man whose quiver is full of them. He is anti taking the life of innocent human lives at any level, but especially in the womb. That's why Jesus said, you cause a child to stumble. It's better for you to have a millstone hung around your neck and be cast into the sea than to cause one of these children to stumble. Now, what do you think his attitude is going to be towards murdering children in the womb? There's very, very few things in the course of human history, even in the midst of all the heinous things that have happened by evil people down through the centuries. I don't know that there's any that compares to killing an innocent child in the womb and ripping its little body apart. And sorry to be so graphic, but we need to understand just how graphic an abortion is. So I tell you, the long suffering of the Lord just is amazing to me. And I think just as we watch things happen in our world today, all of us think it just can't get any worse. And it seems like we got to be near the bottom, because you just can't sink any lower than killing children before they're born, to say nothing of some of the things that happen to them afterwards. Expose News is reporting that JP Morgan CEO wants to confiscate private property to force urgent investment in green energy. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, who has been bought by the World Economic Forum, believes the U.S. government should seize private property to combat climate change. And the article says this is not an exaggeration. In his annual letter to shareholders dated April 4th, 2023, Dimon stated governments, businesses, and non-governmental organizations may need to invoke eminent domain to get adequate investments fast enough for grid, solar, wind, and pipeline initiatives. Eminent domain is a legal term that describes the government using its power to expropriate private property for public use, provided the government provides private owners proper compensation. Implementing socialism would be the fast track way to achieve the World Economic Forum's objectives, the article goes on to say, and we've all heard the famous quote from the World Economic Forum: you will own nothing and be happy. And Dimon is jumping right to the chase and proposing state ownership and the complete abolition of capitalism, the need to provide energy affordably and reliably for today, as well as to make the necessary investments to decarbonize for tomorrow, underscores the inextricable links between economic growth, energy security, and climate change. My wife Terry told me something the other day that she had heard, and it caused me to do a little bit of investigating. And how many of us have heard about, the melting ice caps and the sea levels rising 10 feet or more, and the flooding and massive loss of life that this is going to cause when the polar ice caps melt, the Antarctica melts down, and all these other things. We all see, the videos of the calving glaciers and all, which is just a natural process. It happens every year, happens for generations and generations. But, the interesting thing about this whole thing about, the melting ice caps, and it caused me to actually go and do some homework on it. Do you know what the average temperature is in Antarctica? It's minus 54 degrees. The high temperature in Antarctica is minus 14 degrees. So how can things melt at minus 54 or minus 14 degrees, even when things warm up? Freezing happens at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees above zero. And the high temperature in Antarctica is minus 14. So again, it's just a bunch of hooey. It's about the redistribution of wealth. It has nothing to do with fact or science, and it has everything to do with the globalism of the last days and the desire of the World Economic Forum to basically own everything and for us to have nothing and be completely happy. And now you've got the CEO of JP Morgan Chase jumping on the bandwagon. Now, here's another interesting follow-up story, and this comes from a website called the BizPack Review, business obviously being the focus of the website. They're coming for your food. expert warns the fix is in and restrictions will be next. Globalist social engineering took another step forward in New York City as Mayor Eric Adams rolled out his new emissions goal that led one expert to conclude, they're coming for your food. Often boasting of his own plant based centered life, Adams has continued to champion his lifestyle choices as a path forward for residents of the Big Apple. Last week, that included his announcement with the New York City Department of Environmental Protection that the city would be aiming to cut food based emissions by 33% by the year 2030 by keeping a greenhouse gas inventory. Mark Morano, author of The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown, outlined the slippery slope such an endeavor was careening down. First, they come for your energy, then they come for your gas-powered cars, your freedom of movement, your cheap flights, he contended. Now they're coming for your food. Adams' commitment, which saw him partnering with mayors from cities around the world, set forth a goal of reducing the city's food-based emissions at agencies by 33% by 2030 and challenging our private sector partners to join us by cutting their food emissions by 25% in the same period. The seeds of this had already been planted when Hisner had made plant-based meals the primary option at schools and hospitals, despite being cornered on his own departures from the meatless options. He asserted, we already know that a plant-powered diet is better for your physical and mental health, and I am living proof of that. But the reality is that thanks to the new inventory, we're finding out it's better for the planet. And again, just control, control, control. We're going to tell you what you can eat. We're going to tell you how far. And, we've got these 15-minute cities that are all over the news to where it's a pedestrian type society. No cars are necessary. You can walk anywhere within your assigned city within 15 minutes. You'll own nothing, but you will be completely happy. This has never worked anywhere where socialism or communism has been tried. And there's always the few rich and the rest of the people are poor. Look at Venezuela, look at Cuba and other places around the world and much of China. And, it's just incredible to see that this is now making its way into the thinking of those in power in the U.S. Now, here's another interesting story. And remember that during the tribulation, on the riders, the famed four horsemen of the apocalypse, and when they have their rides of terror, one of the things that's going to take place is there's going to be an incredible food shortage. And this is interesting in light of that. If we remember that during the tribulation, under the rider on the black horse, that there is going to be a quart of wheat sold, which is basically the equivalent of one meal for a whole day's pay. And you can buy 3 quarts of barley, which would equal 3 meals. It's a cheaper grain, and both are obviously representative, even though grain is a major food source all over the world for bread and flour and things of that nature. But, the barley represents 3 meals for one day, will cost you a day's pay. Now, that's for one person. That's not for a family. That's just for one person, 1 meal a day if you buy the wheat for a day's pay, or 3 meals for one person. Now, here's the story. It comes from The Guardian. Fungal attacks threaten global food supplies, say experts. Fast rising fungal attacks on the world's most important crops threaten the planet's future food supply, scientists have said, warning that failing to take fungal pathogens could lead to a global health catastrophe. Fungi are already by far the biggest destroyer of crops. They are highly resilient, travel long distances on the wind, and can feast on large fields of a single crop. They're also extremely adaptable, and many have developed resistance to common fungicides. The impact of the fungal disease is expected to worsen, the researchers say, as the climate crisis results in temperatures rising and fungal infections moving steadily polewards. Since the 1990s, fungal pathogens have been moving to higher latitudes at a rate of about 7 kilometers a year. Wheat stem rust infections, normally found in the tropics, have already been reported in England and Ireland. Higher temperatures also drive the emergence of new variants of the fungal pathogens, while more extreme storms can spread their spores further afield, the scientists say. Professor Sarah Gurr at the University of Exeter in the UK, a co-author of the report, said fungi had recently come to public attention through the hit TV show The Last of Us, in which fungi infect human brains. While that storyline is science fiction, we are warning that we could see a global health catastrophe caused by the rapid global spread of fungal infections. The imminent threat here is not about zombies, but about global starvation. The scientists said there was also a risk that global heating would increase the heat tolerance of fungi, raising the possibility of them hopping hosts to infect warm blooded animals and humans. And the article goes on to present more chilling possibilities. The impact on wheat, rice, corn, and bananas. According to these who are trying to develop pesticides to kill it and all that. But, the Bible says that it is going to be tough during the tribulation as far as food supply. And here you've got efforts to cut back food production through the reduction, of, carbon, food supply, carbon-based emissions, all the other things happening here in the States. And then now you've got, these naturally recurring things contributing to the diminishment of food. Here, I mentioned, I think last week, here in California, by the way, this morning it was raining again, rained hard. And apparently, as I was reading a couple articles earlier today, this storm has been a slow moving storm, a very cold storm moving in to northern and central California. And again, California being completely independent and self-sufficient as far as food goes. All the breadbasket of California, the Central Valley, is still underwater, and they can't plant crops. Obviously, when you've got a lake that is now developed over a vast majority of the area where crops should be going into the ground, and we're going to see here in California and around the country an impact of that come harvest time for these fall harvested items, and just so many things happening simultaneously. And now you've got potential fungi infection impacting the food supply. But let me remind you that we do not have an appointment with God's wrath. And one of the arguments that people often make about the wrath of God is that it's only the second half of the tribulation in which God pours out his wrath. Or you're going to have a hard time making that case looking at Revelation chapter 6, because the wrath of God starts immediately in the form of the consequential wrath of God, in that he allows the Antichrist to rise to power. The whole 7 years is God's wrath. It's not just 3.5 years of wrath. The whole thing is God's wrath. Removing the purifying and preserving influence of the church is an act of God's wrath. It's not, we can't just look at, hailstones of fire mingled with blood and earthquakes and pestilence and all that kind of stuff as God's wrath. We all understand the law of sowing and reaping, the universal law that has been kind of morphed into what goes around comes around, or karma, or the other human names they like to apply to it. But this is a universal law. As a man sows, so shall he reap. Sow to the wind and reap the whirlwind. And that's what's going to happen. And that is God's wrath. Remember what he said about the rebellious generation that came out of Egypt? He said, so I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. He didn't say, I swore in my wrath, I'm going to strike them with earthquakes and hailstones of fire. He said, I'm going to strike them with my consequential wrath. They will not enter into my rest. So remember, we will not see any of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We will not see any of the cataclysmic events that happen during their ride of terror that opens a tribulation period, and we will be with the Lord. And one of the other arguments I like to make is, this is the 70th week of Daniel. Church wasn't here for the first 69. We won't be here for the 70th, because it is carved out for Daniel's people in the holy city. That's what Daniel 9 tells us. So again, as much as we hear these stories, and as disturbing as they are, and we are seeing the precursors to all these things right now, and we very possibly will see food shortages before the rapture of the church, but we're not going to see the worst of it. We will be in heaven, in the Father's house with the Lord. Fox News reports that Boston SatanCon goers shredded a Bible and pro-cop flag during their opening ritual, chanting "Hail Satan." A group of Satanists cheered as two leaders opened SatanCon 2023 on Friday with a formal ceremony renouncing symbols of oppression by ripping up a Bible and a thin blue line flag that represented the police. "We stand here today in defiance of their siege and destroy their symbols of oppression," a female leader told the crowd before ripping pages out of the Bible and throwing them on the floor, a video showed. A male leader joined her in then tearing a thin blue line flag in two, which they also tossed on the floor while the crowd cheered. Satanists in attendance later picked up some of the ripped pages off the floor and posed with them for pictures. "We must build true community outside of the virtual," the male leader also said, before taking a hammer to a keyboard. "Rebelling comes in many forms to each and their own within their own capabilities and their own situation. For some of us, merely existing one more day is victory. But for those of us who can, we must stand up for those who cannot." SatanCon, a sold-out 3-day event, has been touted as the largest satanic gathering in history, and it's being hosted this weekend at the Marriott Copley Place in Boston by the Satanic Temple. Well, isn't that just great? And again, we need to remember that God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. And, Satan is no match for our God. He is a created being, limited in power. And when it comes time, God's going to chain him up for 1,000 years so he can't deceive the nations. And when he releases him for a short time to go out and deceive the nations again at the end of the millennium, God's going to throw him into hell and he'll be there forever, never to bother saved humanity ever again. And, things are tough right now. There's no question about it. We've got another quarter point raise in the interest rate. And, I think it's reached now 5% interest rate, that's at the borrowing from the government level. And, what we see from that is higher than that, obviously, when you want to borrow money. And the economy is tough and all these other things. But again, we're not going to see the worst of it. We will be out of here when it comes time for God to pour out his wrath on this earth. We do not have an appointment with that time, 1 Thessalonians 5:9. Now, we also know that lawlessness is going to abound in the last days. And because of that, the love of many will grow cold, as Jesus said. And the Epic Times reports that shoplifting is out of control in California, and public safety risks causing some to change routines. Business owners, consumers, and employees are facing unprecedented risks to their belongings and their safety because of shoplifting crimes affecting local California communities, with a law enacted by voters nearly a decade ago playing a key role, experts suggest. Passed in 2014, Prop 47 changed the threshold for felony theft, raising the bar from 400 to 950 per incident, enabling thieves to steal just under the upper limit and risk only a misdemeanor. The policy has had grave consequences, according to experts. And after Prop 47 passed, which, by the way, it was presented as disproportionate punishment. We need to, lessen, some of the jail time that people are spending for shoplifting and not give them, huge jail time and all that stuff. And that's how the whole thing was presented. And they did that in order to raise the bar from, felony shoplifting being over 400 to 950 per incident. And after the Prop 47 passed, we saw repeat offenders going into stores and constantly stealing. Rachel Michelin, president and CEO of California Retailers Association, which represents businesses across the state, told the Epic Times. Theft has increased because there are no consequences. And that's what people really want today. They want to be able to do what they want and not have any consequences for breaking the law. And the best way to do that is to get rid of the law. And thus lawlessness is abounding. And, just kind of hand in hand with that story and all of those who are stealing and without anyone, I'm sure we've all seen videos where people are just packing up a shopping cart, walking out of the store, and security standing right there. Nobody does anything to stop them. And then, here we even had a guy trying to stop somebody at Home Depot, and he wound up getting shot and killed. Trying to stop somebody from stealing from the store. And, this is affecting people's livelihoods. And as the article said, their sense of security and their own personal belongings as well are in jeopardy. But another story coming out of the Bay Area, and San Francisco loses another retail giant as shops continue to close down due to crime. Downtown San Francisco has lost another retail giant, Nordstrom, which will be closing both of its stores as the city continues to be plagued by soaring crime. According to a memo from Chief Stores Officer Jamie Nordstrom to employees, the company has decided not to renew its leases for its San Francisco Center Nordstrom store and its Market Street Rack store. We spent more than 35 years serving customers in downtown San Francisco, building relationships with them and investing in the local community, Nordstrom wrote. But as many of you know, the dynamics of downtown San Francisco market have changed dramatically over the past several years, impacting customer foot traffic to our stores and our ability to operate successfully. The San Francisco Center location will close at the end of August, and the Market Street Rack will close on July 1st. So again, you've got people losing their jobs because the government said you should be able to steal up to $950 worth of stuff without consequence. And, just thinking about all of this, I think one of the only things that we can say is, come quickly, Lord Jesus. And how we are looking forward to that moment and twinkling of an eye experience. And, one last real quick mention, I always like to bring up the weather anomalies. And the space weather reported a massive solar flare plunged parts of the earth into radio blackout. And again, as I said many times, I believe in Revelation 16, the sun being given power to scorch men's bodies. I believe that's talking about a coronal mass ejection, where these radioactive ions bombard the earth, break down the earth's magnetosphere, and radiation burns on the skin of mankind is what is being said there. And here you've got one where the sun is in an active cycle right now, and during the blackout, we're told radio signals of the 20 megahertz were lost for about 20 minutes after the solar explosion. A massive solar flare generated by an exploding sunspot on the sun plunged parts of the world, especially the Atlantic Ocean region, into radio blackout, according to media reports. Now, again, if this, like a Category 5 coronal mass ejection, it could disable all electronic equipment on the surface of the earth, and or whatever area takes a direct hit, which could, again, open the door for an invading army. If all of your military hardware is disabled because it's computer run and electronic in nature to whatever degree, or you can't even get gas because the gas pumps are shut down because they are computer operated. Somebody could just walk in the country and take over. So who knows the potential impact of this for the world, or at least a portion of the world, wherever a coronal mass ejection, which is different than a solar flare, keep that in mind, would happen is it's biblical proportion. So anyway, that's our last story for the day. And again, I'll point you back to what Jesus said: when you see these things begin to happen, look up, for your redemption is nigh. And, again, I don't think that can talk about the Jews at the end of the tribulation, because they're not seeing the beginning of them. They're seeing the end of them. And their redemption happens when Jesus comes again and his feet step down on the Mount of Olives. And as Zechariah 12:10 says, they look upon the one whom they pierced, and at that time mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. Well, that's it for this week. And thank you again for joining us. And looking forward to this weekend at the church. And, if you don't, and by the way, Mir's been talking about it, and several others have been talking about it. YouTube seems to be, quenching, shadow banning, and all the other things, just like Facebook has long done. And so please share this. And I would appreciate that as if you'd share the YouTube, especially, the Facebook is just basically hides everything. And so it's kind of a tough uh, social media platform to operate on. But by and large, YouTube we reach a bigger audience, and but I appreciate it if you'd share this and get the word out there because people need to know what's going on. So, well, that's it for this week. And again, thank you for joining this week, and hope you were informed and enlightened a bit. And should the Lord tarry, we'll either see you here, there, or in the air. And God bless you.